Hello everyone. My name is Iman Kwaja. We are pleased that you could all join us for this week's lecture in Volume 11 of our No Neuropsychology didactic series that brings you lectures from experts in the field covering different topics each week. This series was created by trainees and early career neuropsychologists, including standing members of the No Neuropsychology Board, as well as members of the No Neuropsychology Committee. Before we start our lecture, one of the main goals of No Neuropsychology is to provide free, high-quality didactic content to our audiences. Every No Neuropsychology and No Neuroanatomy lecture is available on our YouTube channel and website. Be sure to check it out, subscribe, and like our lectures to get access to content. Additionally, No Neuropsychology works to bring you learning and discussion questions that are provided with specific lectures content. You can access these on our website. Here are the disclaimers for the series. This training is not meant to replace formal education in neuropsychology, and the views of the speakers are their own. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A box on the lower left of your screen, and a recording of today's lecture will be provided on our website and YouTube channel. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ariana Tart-Selvin for today's lecture titled The Ever-Changing Considerations of Working with LGBTQIA+ individuals in Neuropsychology. Dr. Ariana Tart-Selvin, referred to her patients as Dr. TZ, prefers an atypical biography due to recent events and concerns about the funding of institutions she has attended. Instead of detailing her training stages, it is sufficient to state that Dr. TZ completed all requirements to become a neuropsychologist. She currently works in Seattle, Washington, primarily conducting outpatient neuropsychological evaluations for adults and older adults with neurological disorders and neurodegenerative conditions. She is also involved in dementia prevention clinic focusing on reducing dementia risk among women and minority individuals. Since graduate school, she has advocated for improved clinical care for LGBTQIA+ individuals and continues to give talks and didactics on this topic when possible. In her free time, Dr. TZ enjoys hiking, sailing, painting, and attending classic car shows. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. TZ.
Thank you so much, Iman. I appreciate that. And I'm just going to share my screen and we'll get started. Okay. And then, Iman, I'll let me know if you're seeing the correct slide.
I see the correct slide.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So before we get started, let me just fix this title slide. Okay, there we go. That's better. All right. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are in the country. Thank you to everybody who's watching this talk. I want to start by saying that we are living through a time of growing hostility towards LGBTQIA individuals with a tidal wave of legislation and rhetoric that threatens both the rights and well-being of our patients. These sociopolitical forces don't stay outside of our clinic doors. They show up in our patients' mental health, their access to care, and trust in providers. As clinicians, we have a responsibility not only to be informed, but to be affirming, to recognize that inclusive, identity-sensitive care can be life-changing and at times life-saving. Today's talk is about how we can show up better for our patients with humility, competence, and an awareness that affirming healthcare is not just good practice, but an ethical obligation in this moment. All right. These are the learning objectives for the talk today. One thing that I just want to say is You are hardly going to see any references. And this is from talking with, individual researchers and clinicians, not wanting to jeopardize their careers, their funding, the funding of the institutions. But I will provide an email at the end where people can email me and ask for references if they would like them. Happy to provide them. All right, let's dive in. So with the LGBTQ plus population and pretty much any minority population for that matter, it's critical to review the historical context, right? So the medical field in general, which obviously includes psychology and psychiatry, does not have the best track record with, excuse me, with minority populations of any kind, really. Decisions have been made during surgeries that have led to permanent changes in people's bodies without their knowledge. We've used people for experiments without their consent. And unfortunately, LGBTQ plus individuals have experienced longstanding discrimination from society, as well as different and damaging care from medical professionals. So if we look more specifically at psychology and psychiatry, you can see here there's a timeline from the ICD, and there's a lot of details on this slide. Not going to go into all of them. I just want to highlight that it's not a very positive timeline. And this is, again, for the ICD, the International Classification of Disease System that's used by healthcare providers worldwide. And if we look at the DSM timeline, it's not that much better, right? And while the DSM has gotten better recently, the damage was sort of already done, right, with this patient population. So it makes it pretty clear that our field does not have the best history with the LGBTQ plus population. And so it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot of trust in need of repair there, and when we're working with these individuals. Now, what was going on in the world while the ICD and the DSM continued to pathologize LGBTQ plus individuals? Well, we had the Lavender Scare in the 1950s, so that was, McCarthyism, and federal employees, LGBTQ federal employees, were targeted and often fired based on their sexual orientation or assumed sexual orientation if somebody simply thought that of you. There were the Stonewall riots, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which wasn't repealed until 2011. And rather than the Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z that we talk about these days, they had the silent generation, the invisible generation, the epidemic generation during the AIDS crisis. And for those who don't know, AIDS was originally called GRID in the 1980s. So it was gay-related immune deficiency. So what they were basically saying was this was the gay epidemic. So there were many generations that went through a lot of trauma among the LGBTQ population. Now, it's not all bad, right? There are some notable positive developments in psychology and psychiatry that should also be highlighted. One problem, though, is that good news doesn't often make it into mainstream media. And when it does, it still doesn't seem to have quite the effect, right, that the bad news has. And as a result, we don't see desired changes as often or as quickly as we would like. And as you can see here, though, we were actually picking up some, momentum, some good momentum in 2024. And then we entered 2025. So let's set the stage for 2025. In 2025, headlines like these are coming out faster than people can process them. We now have anti-LGBTQ plus legislation coming from all directions, including executive orders insurance restrictions, layoffs, compromised funding for research and clinical trials. And of course, all of these shifts in our socio-political landscape are going to affect clinical care, clinical education, and access to care. Also, this was pretty recent. I'm sure many of us have seen this. For those who haven't, this was a recently published article in the New York Times regarding a decision made by the APA in response to an executive order. This executive order specifically was about, quote, ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity. Now, the reality is today that there are some states in which declaring or demonstrating a commitment to diversity is now illegal. And the APA, as a reminder, does not accredit institutions. Rather, they accredit programs, master's programs, doctorate programs within an institution. And during that accreditation process, the state laws in which that institution resides have to be taken into account. Now, I can't answer whether or not the APA had to do this, removing this commitment that they required graduate programs to demonstrate to diversity. I do wish they could have gone about it a little bit differently, because while it is incredibly unlikely that the American Psychological Association had negative intentions in making this decision, we all know that perception is often more important and more influential than intention. So this decision has already shocked, hurt, damaged, offended, scared LGBTQ plus individuals, among others, even if it wasn't meant to do that. Also, because this happened in response to an executive order, I did want to take a few minutes to get into executive orders, some relevant ones at least. So until recently, I couldn't tell you much about what an executive order is or what it does. But given recent events, it behooved me to learn more about executive orders. So the key function of an executive order is to serve as a form of political messaging. It's an attempt to direct federal agencies to take specific administrative actions within a designated time frame. They cannot override congressional statutes, contradict Supreme Court decisions, or exceed the authority delegated to the president. Now, depending on the content of the executive order, its impact and timing of implementing things can vary. And these executive orders, the ones here that I've mentioned, are additional things that are happening right now that are also going to likely negatively affect our clinical education, clinical care, access to care, whether they have the legal power to do so or not, because people are giving them that power, whether they have that power or not. So, we're already seeing the effects of these executive orders. And another instance of something to, sort of be aware about, have on your radar, this was pointed out to me by a colleague recently on the website for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for their Healthy People 2030. If you go onto that website and you type anything into their search bar and click enter, the results will appear. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you see this paragraph. Now, I don't love it when people read off their slides directly, and I think this, warrants an exception. So at the bottom of their website, this is there. Per a court order, the Health and Human Services is required to restore this website as of 11:59 p.m. February 14th, 2025. Any information on this page promoting gender ideology is extremely inaccurate and disconnected from the immutable biological reality that there are two sexes, male and female. The Trump administration rejects gender ideology and condemns the harms it causes to children by promoting their chemical and surgical mutilation and to women by depriving them of their dignity, safety, well-being, and opportunities. This page does not reflect biological reality, and therefore the administration and this department rejects it. So imagine being, somebody who goes on there and, searches gender identity. Is being gay a phase? And then this pops up at the bottom of the website, right? So things like this, again, they're already causing damage. All right, let's go ahead and get rid of this trash. Okay, great. So even if we are getting these executive orders and having statements like this on websites and their policies are changing, we still have our ethics code where we have principles and recommendations to follow. And I want you all to keep these in mind as we go into unique considerations to be made when working with LGBTQ plus individuals in the context of neuropsychology. So what can we do? A lot, actually. The good news is that all of us can make a difference in the lives of our patients and their families, not by being perfect, but by being intentional. Small, consistent changes in how we listen, how we document, how we ask questions, and how we advocate can have a powerful effect on our patients and their lives. So let's talk about what that looks like in clinical practice. What are some of the things that we can do, right? So one of the first things we can do is acknowledge some mental health disparities and factors of minority stress. Now, I think all the statistics and facts on this slide are likely, pretty well known at this time among, those who are listening. LGBTQ plus individuals are at a higher risk of depression, anxiety, STDs, STIs, suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior, the list goes on. And we also have the minority stress model, which has been extended or expanded on several times since 2003, which includes factors like, excuse me, like chronic stress from stigma, discrimination, micro and macroaggressions, internalized homophobia and transphobia. And everything on this slide will adversely affect cognitive development, cognitive functioning, emotional development, physical health, and so on. Now, first, I'm going to talk about general considerations. These are things that should be considered appropriate working with a patient of any age, right? And the first thing on here is to provide a safe and affirming space. Now, as neuropsychologists, I think we all know that sometimes the most challenging part of helping a patient is simply trying to find out what the problem is, right? So it's important to remember that with the best of intentions, our ability to help others is limited by how welcome, how comfortable, and how safe they feel. Because if they don't feel welcome and safe and comfortable, it is very unlikely that they are going to tell you what's really going on with them. So, how do you provide a safe space? What does that look like? Well, it can be in the way you question. It can be the fact that you're knowledgeable about the LGBTQ resources available at your hospital, trying to not demonstrate certain biases. It can also be in signs and artwork and a rainbow pin on your badge or your lanyard, a safe zone sign on your door. I promise you the tiniest of rainbows will be noticed. Also, these symbols will go a long way should you accidentally demonstrate a bias such as the heterosexual bias. So, excuse me. Don't assume that a boy or a man is dating or married to a girl or a woman if they say that they're in a relationship. don't assume that if somebody has two parents, it's a mom or a dad. And I have seen incredibly experienced clinicians accidentally demonstrate this bias. So one thing that I like to, tell people is stop and take a minute and think, am I demonstrating a bias here? Ask yourself, would you ask this exact question or say this thing if you were talking to a cisgender, straight individual? And if the answer is no, then you should have a really good reason as to why you need to treat an LGBTQ plus individual differently in this specific instance. Now, I'm not saying that it's never appropriate. I am giving an entire presentation on unique considerations to be made when working with LGBTQ plus individuals and how you might need to do things differently sometimes. What I am saying is that it is never appropriate to allow your curiosity, for example, to result in you providing different or inappropriate care to your patients. That's something to consider, right? All right, moving on here. All right, another general consideration, acknowledge your level of competency and consult when appropriate. Reach out to a colleague, email me. There'll be an email at the end of this. Also, know your alphabet. And I'm not talking about your ABCs. I'm talking about this alphabet. This is the first of several slides that's going to contain a lot of information. These are good to reference later because I'm not going to spend too much time on them. Also, folks, I identify as a lesbian. And while it took me a little while to figure myself out, I basically did a literature review to try to find answers. I have been an active member of the LGBTQ plus community for a long time now, and I still can't keep track of all the letters and what all of the terms mean. So you do the best you can. And when you make a mistake, because you will, we all will, we're human, you correct yourself and you move on. And if you don't know what a term means that a patient uses, just ask them. It won't highlight a lack of competency, as you might fear. Rather, it will highlight your humility, your willingness to learn, and your intention to provide this individual with tailored care based on their answer. So it seems like it puts you in a pretty good light, right? So just ask. Another general consideration, test selection. So this is a big one. Excuse me. It comes up often. Many of us know that our norms are outdated. They imply a sense of female inferiority. Pediatric norms don't have gender differences, which tells us that it's not really innate. We have greater intragroup variability than intergroup variability. So just as a reminder, right, there's more of a difference within genders than between genders. So if you really think about it, is there a strong argument why we shouldn't just use age and level of education? I don't have one. So that's something to think about. These are more of those slides to reference later. They are categorized by cognitive domain. They are not gender-based. These can be incredibly helpful to reference when you're thinking about your test battery. And I cannot take credit for these fabulous slides. They come from a lot of work that Dr. Emily Trishu does, and they've helped me a lot. And I know I've passed them on to other neuropsychologists, and they've helped a lot when they're thinking, should I give this test or that test? It's a nice list to reference. All right. And then it's also important to make sure you're thinking about hormone therapy or hormone replacement therapy when you're conceptualizing your cases. So LGBTQ plus individuals are more likely to receive hormone therapy compared to their cisgender heterosexual peers for a variety of reasons, and at a variety of ages. So it's important to consider this information and be flexible. So if a transition has occurred, consider writing in your report, historically he, da da da, currently she, da da da. But check with your patient first. Please don't out your patient or reveal that they've had a transition if they don't want that in the report. It's important to be flexible. And in pediatrics specifically, I think you need to be even a little more flexible because kids are really, they're exploring more and they're going through this gender identity, right? So let's go ahead and get into some of the specific considerations that people should make when working with LGBTQ plus individuals in a pediatric setting. And then we'll move on to adults and older adults. So when you're assessing youth, there are several considerations to be made. This is the gender unicorn. It's a great tool to use with kids and sometimes adults. Excuse me. And remember, when you are going through the history, when you're talking to a kid, as I just mentioned, they're still figuring things out. They haven't been taught how to do a literature review yet. I'm just kidding. But seriously, they are still, potentially very fluid as they're thinking about their gender identity, their gender expression. Also, you might see the same patient, right, before and after a transition. They might change their pronouns in between appointments. So it's important for you to be very flexible and check in with them a lot and ask if anything has changed since you saw them last, even if, maybe a good amount of time has passed between your evaluation and feedback. So it's good to check in, discuss limitations with them right from the beginning. Your report should not come as a surprise to a patient. Rather, it should represent a collaborative process with the patient and the family that started at the very beginning. So if you already know you're likely going to have to use gendered norms, talk about it with them, explain why you need to do that. Talk to the patient about how they want to be referred to in the report, their names, their pronouns. In pediatrics, right, you have to remember there's a different audience for their reports. So as opposed to adults, the kids will likely read it. The parents, maybe a teacher, a principal, a school counselor. So you want to make sure everything in the report is known and hopefully approved by the patient. You also need to consider state laws and institutional policies when deciding how to write names and pronouns in your report. And the big thing is to remember that we are ethically obligated to provide informed consent regarding this. So your patients really have to know, what's going on and what you're going to say in the report. Now, let's say you have a patient come in and they walk in and they say, "Hi, my name is Sandra. My pronouns are she, her." And the parents immediately jump in and say, "No, your name is Sam and you're a boy." So what can you do in that situation? Well, you can, try to facilitate a more collaborative conversation. See if if there's wiggle room, excuse me, anywhere. But if there's not, and the parents are, holding their ground and the kid is holding their ground, remember your role in this situation, right? And that role might require us to hold back some things that we would, like to say or we'd like to do. But you can take a minute and turn towards Sandra and say, "Hey, Sandra, thank you so much for introducing yourself to me, and your pronouns is she, her. I will be talking to you as Sandra today, and I'm really looking forward to working with you. And as you, just heard, your parents refer to you as Sam and, say that you're a boy. And I might not be able to put or use Sandra and she, her pronouns in my entire report because of this. But I want you to know that I heard you and I respect you, and I will be calling you Sandra today. So again, you might have some of those tricky situations with kids, and you have to take them on a case-by-case basis. There's no hard and fast rule that will work with all of them. Other specific considerations, right? Remember, bullying, specifically LGBTQ youth, are at a much higher risk to be bullied. Religious trauma. So remember, as kids, you pretty much just follow what your parents do in terms of religion, and you go where they go, and you do what they do, and you pray to who they pray. So if you start questioning yourself, and you are part of a religious family, that can be uniquely challenging. Also, it's important to remember that when appropriate, you can highlight positive, effects associated with coming out or transitioning. So, for example, look, it's a source. It's exciting, right? Um, for example, Olson and colleagues in 2016 conducted a study where they looked at transgender youth who had socially transitioned. And, excuse me, they were able to see that among those individuals, there was less depression, there were only slightly increased levels of anxiety compared to population averages. So we can see here in this study, and you can look at it more closely later, that the presence of psychopathology is not a given for these individuals, right? Parents might wonder, well, but if they transition, for sure they're going to become depressed, right? No, it might be the exact opposite. If they don't transition, they might become depressed or remain depressed. Look, another source. Russell et al. In 2018 examined the use of chosen name, right? This is incredibly important in different contexts. So they looked at youth across the country. There was a group in the Northeast, the Southwest, and the West Coast. And they found that if a chosen name is, excuse me, used in multiple contexts, it affirms somebody's gender identity, and it actually reduces things like suicidal thoughts and suicidal behavior. So these can be important to stress with parents. Now, when we think about assessing LGBTQ adults, we still want to make all the same, respectful and affirming considerations that we make with kids. And we might want to, consider some other ones. So norms comes up again, right? And I like to talk about this because many times in the adult world, excuse me, we feel like when we, score something, we have to check a box, male or female, if we're using, gender-based norms, and then we have to check that same box across the board. So one easy thing to do, right, for an LGBTQ patient is when it's appropriate, you could consider scoring everything twice. Yes, I realize that makes more work for us. And you could also show the patient, hey, I didn't have the perfect measure and I couldn't score it in the perfect way. And I respect you as a person and your gender identity. And so I wanted to show you, what I did. I scored it both ways. So, let's talk about this. That can go a long way with a patient. Another thing that you can consider is using, for example, the patient's sex assigned at birth, let's say that's male, for measures of intellectual functioning. And then you could consider using their current gender of female and she, her pronouns, and check the box of a female on measures of personality, right? Because that involves how people are in the world, right? How they present themselves, how people interact with them and perceive them, and how those patients, interpret those interactions. That's pretty wrapped up in personality, right? So it might be appropriate to consider being flexible in a way that you may not have considered before. Again, one of those unique considerations to think about. Also, religious trauma is not exclusive to pediatrics. So while I came out as an adult and I was more in control of my own religion, I wasn't simply doing, what my parents told me to do. I went through a time where I questioned, are my prayers counting? Is anybody listening? Am I wasting my time? And while I came through that, that's a difficult journey to go through, even if you have support. So that's another, consideration to think about and question when you're working with adults. Um, there are also really important unique cognitive implications to consider. uh, Health conditions that have unique neurocognitive implications, right? So everything on here has unique or important neurocognitive implications to note. The really big one that stood out for me was the worse cancer-related outcomes. And the research actually provides a lot of information on this. It's explained in several ways. So, due to that lack of trust and fear regarding the healthcare system and providers, LGBTQ individuals are less likely to go into a hospital and report symptoms and get screened. So, things are not caught as early. Even if things are caught, right, and they know that they need treatment, again, they can be worried about going into a hospital and being discriminated and feeling like they're not getting appropriate treatment. Or maybe the treatment is hormonal treatment and they're worried about having to sacrifice, a transition that they made that saved their lives, right? By having to take hormones. Also, sex education curriculums pretty much only focus on healthy, safe sex practices for cisgender heterosexual individuals. So there are highly educated LGBTQ plus individuals that think, oh, I'm having sex with my same sex partner. I can't get an STD. I can't get an STI. So I don't need to go in for my regular checkups, right? I'll be fine. So, for example, trans men are 37% less likely to be up to date on their pap smears. It makes sense, right, as to why, given their education and, potentially that fear of going into the hospital. But that also means that when LGBTQ plus individuals do have something as serious as cancer and it goes on for too long, excuse me, it's never caught, it's not treated in time, these individuals have worse outcomes, higher rates of disability if they survive. So these are really important considerations to make. Also, when you're working with adults, remember that we are in a different time now, right? That 2025 transition that we went through, patients have already started expressing concerns about their, excuse me, even just their gender being mentioned in a report, especially, sexual orientation, which isn't really necessary to, mention in reports. And it's also important for you to remember that outed LGBTQ plus individuals, as opposed to closeted LGBTQ plus individuals, are more likely to lose their jobs if they work at religious institutions, same or not same sex, but all boys schools or all girls schools, if they're in the military, professional athletes, especially males, family companies with religious values, or at will work. So there can be really serious consequences if you were to out your patient in any way. So please don't out your patient. Excuse me. Remember, your report is a collaborative process. They should know everything that's going in there. And we ask a lot of questions. It doesn't mean that you have to put everything in the report, right? There are also unique considerations to be made when you're thinking of your recommendations. So, for example, LGBTQ plus adults are, just a second, excuse me. They're more likely to be alone than their cisgender heterosexual siblings. They're less likely to have kids. They might have more disposable income because they don't have kids that are really expensive. So if they're in a family where they are the only LGBTQ plus sibling and the parents are aging, they're more likely to have more caregiver burden compared to their cisgender heterosexual siblings, right? Because, oh, you don't have kids. Can you go take mom to her appointment? And, you're not paying for daycare. So can you go buy those medications that, our parents need? And that really adds up. So research shows there is a higher caregiver burden among LGBTQ plus individuals caring for their parents because it's in a different way if there are other siblings that could be helping, but they're not. So something to consider when you're writing those recommendations, find out what's already on their plate. All right. Now we're going to talk about older adults. This is my favorite population, so I'm a little biased. And for those of you who don't know, this is Edie Windsor and the Aspire. If you don't know who they are, you should look them up. It'll be worth it. So, what are some considerations to be made when working with older adults? I really love this quote, people age as they have lived. And these individuals have not necessarily had the most peaceful, right, life. Remember that horrible history that we talked about at the beginning? All of our older adults lived through that terrible history. So you need to take into consideration things like lifespan trauma, lifespan chronic stress. LGBTQ plus individuals are more likely to have had longer spans of social isolation compared to their cisgender heterosexual peers. And that can really add up over time, as we know, and affect things like, depression, anxiety, suicidality, for example. So think about these things because if you add up the compounding effects over a lifespan, of course, that's going to negatively affect their health and their cognitive functioning. It puts them at a higher risk of mild neurocognitive disorder and major neurocognitive disorder or dementia. Also remember that among this older LGBTQ community, they don't have access to the same resources, especially in different areas. So if you look at older adults, for example, who are part of the LGBTQ population and they live in a rural area, they don't have access to, that many services. So keeping in mind, right, maybe, changes or considerations that you might need to make. So instead of recommending something locally or trying to find something locally for them that might not exist, maybe you need to expand your search a little bit when you look for resources that you want to recommend. Other important things to take into consideration with older adults is that an affirming intake process to build trust is going to be incredibly important. Incredibly. Because remember, these individuals lived through the Lavender Scare and Stonewall riots, right? So just for example, today's 88-year-old gay man was in his 20s when we had the Lavender Scare. So Stonewall riots, today's 77-year-old trans woman was 21. So again, this kind of highlights that importance of taking into account lifetime stress and discrimination, which have very likely affected somebody's mental health and cognitive functioning. It's also to take into consideration, right, their personal history. You really want to talk about that in detail. Remember that the normative data is even more so limited in this population. Cultural factors, excuse me, all of those need to be part of your conceptualization with this patient. Another important consideration that I like to stress is the idea of chosen family and advanced care planning with older LGBTQ plus individuals. So remember how I said earlier that LGBTQ plus individuals were more likely to experience social isolation, potentially, maybe they don't have children or their partner died, from HIV and AIDS, and so they're alone. Maybe they are no longer in contact with their family. So LGBTQ plus individuals are much more likely than their cisgender heterosexual peers to have what we call chosen family, right? So maybe their aunt is not their biological aunt, but it's the aunt who has played an important role in their life and who's been there for them when they need help. Maybe their neighbor is like a brother to them or a sister to them. So when you're writing your recommendations, don't assume that their biological family will be the ones to help. Because we have to ask about their biological family, right? We need to know medical history. That's important. And don't assume that that's the family who's going to be there helping them through these recommendations that you're going to give them. Ask about chosen family and good friends that they can count on to take them to appointments and maybe even go with them to appointments, right? Consider saying, hey, yeah, why don't you bring your brother, who's not actually their biological brother, to your feedback appointment? Are you comfortable with that? So we can talk about these things and, ways in which they can help. That will very likely be appropriate and it will go a long way with your patient. Also, especially with geriatric individuals, we have to remember that they could have incredibly unique experiences and unique needs when it comes to advanced care planning. So, for example, one of our geriatric primary care providers recently presented on a case where an older individual transitioned later in life, which is incredibly common because remember, it wasn't safe for them to come out previously. And then soon after, they were diagnosed with dementia and they didn't remember that they had transitioned. Instead, they had reverted back to the person who was still closeted. And the family who had abandoned them when they transitioned all of a sudden was back in the picture. They changed out the person's clothes in their closet. They reverted back to the person's dead name and their old pronouns. Yes, this case also blew my mind too. Yeah. And it's something I would have never thought about, especially as a trainee, right? To think about. So having an older adult go through certain questions with you, such as if you no longer remember that you changed your name or your pronouns or that you came out or that you transitioned and you later, you don't remember this and something happens, right? Family comes back into the role or, the family is still there. Do you want us to tell you? Do you want us to tell you that you've transitioned, that you came out of the closet? What do you want us to do? And I don't think that's going to be a consistent answer from patient to patient, right? So it's important to ask those questions should that happen, because it probably would not have occurred to them, especially while they're cognitively intact, right? So with older adults, having some of those unique questions prepared for your evaluations is also important, and definitely can go a long way with your patients and demonstrating the affirming and thorough care that you are trying to provide to them. So what are the take-home messages here? We have to be affirming and adaptable. We need to pursue trainings and stay up to date, all of that. And I would say one of the most important things is that we need to remain humble, right? Regarding our competency and our abilities to understand these unique considerations, especially if you are not a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And even if you are, right? So I identify as a cisgender, Caucasian presenting lesbian. I am not going to pretend like I understand or experience the challenges an 80-year-old Black gay male experienced, right? I am not going to pretend like I understand and have felt the experience of a lesbian who came out and as a result lost their friends and their family. And as a result, they were kicked out of their house when they were 16 and had to grow up really fast and take care of themselves, right? Because I didn't experience that. At the end of the day, we only know our own stories, right? So try to make your patients feel safe and welcome and comfortable enough that they share their story with you and enable you to help them. All right, that is pretty much wrapping us up. I just want to share some resources that people can reference later. I do want to thank a lot of people and institutions who have let me put their logos on here. And the many individuals who helped contribute to this presentation, who let me practice in front of them, especially more than once. And thank you all for attending. I hope this improves the care that you provide for your patients. There's an email here. You can email me with questions and a QR code. All right, so I guess we'll jump into some questions now.
Yeah, yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Teasy. That was such an incredible presentation, and we so appreciate the thoughtfulness, the intentionality, and definitely your vulnerability in sharing all this information, not only about yourself, but just sharing how to, just really showing how to show compassion in such a vulnerable way. I think there's so many things that I could talk about, but just the highlighting and emphasis on access, how that can just derail everything if you don't have that, the transparency with patients and families. I personally, because I work in pediatrics, I appreciate the examples of transparency that you gave to have with the patient and with the parent. And then additional considerations with the report. Like you said, our reports are going to schools, and maybe the patient has come out and is accepted by their family, but maybe not in school. So, do we write two reports, and what does that look like? I think something that was interesting to hear too in terms of interpretation was highlighting perhaps we use male sex for IQ interpretation and female sex for measures of personality. That I think if that's something that resonates with the patient, that makes a lot of sense. Um, Caregiver burden, that for me, I had not even thought about that. And I'm so happy that you highlighted that for these patients. We do have some questions here that I would like to ask. Um, so if, you talked about if it's available and you had those amazing slides on tests that have norms without gender, right, being considered. So if we are using tests that we can just focus on age, and let's say we have a patient that is undergoing hormone replacement therapy, so that kind of helps that perspective out. But the question is, are there any additional considerations that need to be made regarding interpreting cognitive performance, speed, mood, etc., that we need to be mindful of?
Yes. So I'm going to pull up a slide real quick that has a chart with different hormone replacement therapies and how long the person has been on them, the dose, and exactly how that relates to different cognitive domains. I'm just kidding. I really wish that's
You
um
had me for a second there. I was like, oh my gosh, this is an incredible resource. I cannot believe this exists.
it would be lovely, right? And I hope we get there. It most definitely does not exist, and we're nowhere even close.
Mhm.
So for all the research that shows that something, a particular hormone affects processing speed or verbal comprehension abilities, there's another study that shows the complete opposite.
Mhm.
So there's not enough research to guide us, right? To have a very comfortable uh, answer that we can feel cognitive or confident of in clinical practice. So while we're waiting on that magical table, right, to be contributed, you can, excuse me, you can and you should look into that research. There is some consistency in how quickly certain hormone therapies can begin to affect cognitive functioning. Um, and there is some consistency in the domains in which you might want to pay particular attention to,
Mhm.
or make a consideration, for example, during your conceptualization. And again, we don't have a guide for that right now. We don't have a correct answer for that. So in that case, I think you delve into that research, excuse me, and if anybody wants specific articles, please email me with that question and I can send those out. So you do that. You look at those research, look at those studies, and take your patient's unique case, right, into account. So have they transitioned? Was it a social transition, a hormonal transition, surgeries, how long, things like that. You use your clinical judgment to incorporate that into your conceptualization as best as you can. And then you call it out as a major limitation, right?
Mhm.
And explain to the patient, this is a problem with our field. And I wish I could do better for you, and I hope I can do better in the future. In the meantime, I went through all this literature, and let me tell you what I was able to include in my consideration. And hopefully, this is helpful for you. So, hopefully, that's a helpful answer or approach to consider.
Again, Dr. Teasy, such an intentional, thoughtful, and comprehensive answer that it's going to be so helpful in terms of when we're working with these patients and families in terms of interpretation, transparency, and hopefully building stronger relationships with this community, given all of the hardships and trauma that have existed in the past with healthcare. Um, we are at the hour, so we just want to say thank you again for your time and expertise. We're so grateful to you and hope you have a lovely rest of your day and week. And everyone here, please make use of the QR code and the email as Dr. TC has provided. And we're just so grateful. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me to give this talk. And thank you for everybody who attended and everyone, again, who contributed. Hope everybody has a good rest of their day.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.